Hey everyone, we're going to start almost on time. There will be some people straggling in here. I hope you found parking, and I hope you found it easy to find this space. It's good to see all of you. Anyways, I want to thank Mark Ferrari, who's been extraordinarily helpful in providing us with all the things we need. And I want to thank Ridgewood High School. And as president of the Network for Responsible Public Policy, and my name is Rhoda Shermer, I want to thank all of you for being here. And if you were able to make a donation, I want to tell you how appreciative we are, because you helped defray the costs of our next program, which will be October 17th, called the Know-It-All Society, and that'll be at Fairleigh Dickinson University in Hackensack at 7:30 p.m. So, we are so thrilled that we were able to bring Lawrence Lessig, one of our nation's treasures, intellectual leaders, to Ridgewood, to 350 students this afternoon, and to all of you tonight. So we're looking forward again to hearing him talk about the challenges facing our democracy. Now I see some new faces here, quite a few new faces. So for you, I want you to get familiar with the Network for Responsible Public Policy. You could go to our website, that's easy, and there's plenty of information about what we do there. Also notices of upcoming programs, and what's really special is an archive of videos of all our past programs, and they cover a wide range of public policy issues with incredible thought leaders also. But the short version is we're nonpartisan, we're a volunteer organization, and we are committed to democracy. We want to see it flourish. And the way we feel we can help do that is by providing you and the general public anywhere with quality programs, credible information from reliable, trusted sources. We want to mitigate polarization. We want people to be able to talk to each other. We want people to pick issues they can get passionate about and get engaged with. So that's what we do, and we welcome volunteers, donations, and the help you can give. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to ask Mark Ferrari to please introduce our wonderful speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhoda. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Ferrari. I'm the supervisor of the humanities here at RHS. I'm a former longtime American history teacher here, so I'm real excited about tonight's presentation. And I was a former student here, so I'm a little bit of a Ridgewood lifer. So welcome to the Ridgewood neighborhood. It's our great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lawrence Lessig. He's a distinguished scholar, as Rhoda had mentioned, whose work intersects the fields of philosophy, economics, law, and politics. Dr. Lessig was a professor at both Stanford Law School, where he founded the school's Center for Internet and Society, and at the University of Chicago, prior to his current appointment as the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School. He's an acclaimed author of numerous books, including his most recent one, America Compromise, and I think they have some copies back on the balcony if you'd like to purchase one. This lecture is brought to RHS, as Rhoda said, by the Network for Responsible Public Policy, so I really want to thank her team for bringing another excellent scholar here. We're trying to develop a habit of hosting scholars on contemporary issues to engage our students in what I would consider their civic responsibility. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce, if you can give a warm welcome to Dr. Lawrence Lessig.
Thank you so much, and especially Rhoda, thank you so much. Rhoda brought me down here, I guess it would have been 4 years ago, 2015. Yeah. And she has been an inspiration in building this organization. I think that what America needs, yes, I think. to counterbalance the crazy, which is our culture of politics right now, is a focused practice, a discipline, a religion of learning how to talk across partisan lines about important issues that affect the whole nation. And this program here in New Jersey is inspiration. I'm so happy to be back. So I want to start by saying you know something that's true, something that is true. You're here, we're all here, because you know something that is true. You know we live in the greatest democracy that never was, promised to us by the oldest living written constitution that there ever was, and yet still to this day that promise has not been performed. And my view is it is time that it be performed, because we cannot wait any longer for that promise to be real. It has been more than 20 years since a clear majority of Americans were convinced that climate change was real and that we were responsible, and yet Congress has not passed a single piece of comprehensive legislation to address climate change. The healthcare system in America is one of the most expensive in the world, with 25% of the amount we spent on the administrative budget, and still 12% of Americans uninsured. And yet all our Congress can talk about is whether or not we will continue to guarantee insurance for those with pre-existing conditions. Infrastructure in America is said to have been graded a D by the American engineering experts. They say that we have to spend $1.5 trillion in the next 5 years to make America safe again. But the closest that our Congress can come to the number 1.5 trillion is $1.6 trillion in tax cuts to the richest Americans and corporations that will not have any effect. It has not had any effect in driving an economic recovery. Now, my view is this is not caused by one man. This problem is not due to the president. The problem is a system that does not represent us. Now, you can say that's a system compromised. That's the emphasis of my book that was published last year, America Compromised. You can say it's the product of a system that does not represent us. That's the theme of my book that's coming out in a month. You should pre-order your copies right now. We could pause if you want to do that. Either way of seeing this, the argument I want you to see tonight is that to solve these problems, these fundamental problems of America's democracy, we have to fix it. We have to fix this system, and we have to convince the politicians that it needs to be fixed first. These problems are the most important problems. You pick which you care about most, whether it's climate change or healthcare or the future of our economy or infrastructure. I don't care. Whatever problem you think is the most important problem, that's the most important problem. But my problem, this problem, is the first problem. If we don't fix this problem, none of those other problems will ever be addressed sensibly. Okay, so how do we do it? Well, I think the first thing we have to do is we have to see the source of the problem. We have to understand why we have the inability of our government now to function. And that source, I want to say, is a certain kind of inequality. I don't mean racial inequality, I don't mean sex inequality, I don't mean economic inequality. What I mean is political inequality. Henry David Thoreau wrote, "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the roots." I want to say that this is the root. Though I spent many years saying money in politics was the root, I've discovered an even deeper root. It's not that money in politics is not important, it is critically important. But money in politics is just one example of many examples of a system that renders us unequal as citizens. And it's that inequality of citizens that makes it so our democracy does not function. The framers of our Constitution gave us what they called a republic. And by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. Now, the idea behind a representative democracy is that the system is representative. It's kind of built into the word, right? Representative democracy means we are represented equally. Yet our system is unrepresentative because of the many ways in which it renders us unequal as citizens. So think about a couple dimensions of that. Do we as citizens have an equal freedom to vote? The answer is we have no equal freedom to vote because states administer voting systems to make it harder for the party that just doesn't happen to be in power. That typically is African Americans in states that have Republican administrations because African Americans vote primarily Democratic, but you don't have to see it as racism. It's just politics. But what that means is that those who are in the party out of power find it harder because of rules designed to make it harder for them to vote, or inequalities in access to voting machines or the capacity to vote. That inequality suppresses the vote of many. Charles Stewart at MIT estimates in the last election, 16 million Americans found their vote suppressed because of this inequality. Or do we have an equal freedom to vote for president? We do not. Not so much because of the Electoral College, more importantly because of a system called winner take all, built into the Electoral College. All but 2 states allocate all of their Electoral College votes to the winner of the popular vote. So if you win the plurality by even 5 votes, by even 1 vote, you get all of the Electoral College votes in that state. But what that means is that this is not the country that picks America, that picks our president. This is the country that picks our president. This country. This country is the country made up of these so-called swing states. Because if you're a candidate running for president, it makes no sense to campaign anywhere except in this country, the country of swing states. In 2016, 95% of campaign appearances were in these states, 99% of campaign spending. The only time candidates went out of these states is when they went to New York or to California to raise money. This is the country that picks our president. These are the swing states. Let's call them the swingers in America. But here's the thing. The swingers don't represent America. They're older, they're whiter, their industry is a kind of 19th century, early 20th century industry. There are 7.5 times the number of people in America working in solar energy as mine coal. But you don't hear of solar energy in presidential elections because those people come from Texas and California. You hear about coal miners because coal miners are in these swing states. So what that means is, if you don't come from a swing state, your vote doesn't matter. And even if you do come from a swing state, if you happen to vote for the minority, your vote will not even be registered because all of the Electoral College votes will go to the person who won the majority. So that means in the last election, 85 million people went to the polls to have their vote just not matter in the selection of the president. Or do we have an equal vote in the House of Representatives? And the answer is obviously no, because of gerrymandering. States work hard to draw their districts. I know New Jersey has had a recent fight about whether this would be true or not, and I was very excited to see the extraordinary citizens movement in New Jersey that stopped partisan gerrymandering in New Jersey. But most states draw their districts to produce safe seats so that they can guarantee which party will win in a particular district. And they draw these districts in this extraordinarily creative way. Christopher Ingraham calls these crimes against geography. As you draw the district to guarantee it will produce the result that you want it to produce. But the thing about safe seats is that though they guarantee which party will win, what they also do is mean that the only politicians who can challenge the incumbent are politicians who are even more extreme than the incumbent. So if you're a safe seat Republican congressperson, what you're fearful of is an even more extreme right-wing Republican challenger, because it's the base which is typically polarized to the extreme that's going to show up in the primary. Or if you're a safe seat liberal Democrat, what you're worried about is an even more liberal Democrat who will show up and challenge you, because you know that the base in the Democratic primary will be the most liberal base. So what that means is Congress people are constantly looking to the extremes, because they are constantly fearful that the extremes will challenge them, which produces a system that empowers the extremes relative to the rest of those who would vote, which is why Congress right now is polarized far more than America is polarized. That's a product of the system of gerrymandering. And if you add up those whose votes therefore don't matter, it's about 89 million Americans on this dimension who don't have an equal place in our democracy. Or the most extreme, the most grotesque, the most obvious of inequalities is the inequality in the way we fund campaigns. We take it for granted in America that congressional campaigns will be privately funded. And what that means is that candidates for Congress and members of Congress spend their time raising money. Now you think, how much time do they spend raising money? The answer is they spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money. 30 to 70% of their time dialing for dollars, calling people up. Today when I talked to the kids, they weren't quite sure what this technology was, but seemed to be familiar. But the point is they're calling up these people, sucking up to people with power to raise the money they need to get their party back into power, to themselves back into the office. Now, when they're calling for half their time, they're not calling the average American. They're calling about 120,000 Americans who are the Americans who give enough to be worth their time to call. Those 120,000 Americans, then, have enormous power relative to the people who are not called. And as they do this, as members of Congress do this, it affects them. B.F. Skinner gave us this image of the Skinner box, where any stupid animal could learn which buttons it needed to push to get the sustenance it needed to survive. This is a picture of the life of a congressperson right now, as they learn through this process which buttons they need to push to get the sustenance they need to survive. It has an effect on them. They develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money. Not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. So this dynamic means some people have enormous power, the funders, and the rest of us don't, which means about 139.5 million Americans have less power because of this feature of our system, while a tiny fraction don't. And if we had to make this actually proportionate, we'd have to cut off 4/5 of the head of this person to make the numbers actually fit the graph. Okay, so add all these together, and it's pretty obvious what the consequence is. They don't represent us. In each of these dimensions, they don't represent us. It's not just the money. It's the extremism because of partisanship. It's not just the partisanship. It's the inequality and suppression of vote because of the way administrators make it harder for the other party to vote. It's not just the suppression of vote. It's also the fact the president doesn't care about America. The president cares about that weird country that I showed you by linking together the swing states. Add these all together. They don't represent us. And it's not just a theory, it's a reality. There's a Princeton study. As a Harvard professor, I like to get that off the stage as quickly as I can. Martin Gillens and Ben Page did the largest empirical study of the actual decisions of our government in the history of political science, relating those actual decisions of our government over the last 40 years to the attitudes of the economic elite, presumptively funders of campaigns, the attitudes of organized interest groups, and the attitudes of the average voter. What they found with the economic elite is what you'd expect. As the percentage of the elites support something, the probability that that thing had been passed went up. That's the way you'd expect it. The more who support it, the more likely it is to be passed. So 0% supported, about 0% it's going to be passed. 100% supported, about a 36% chance that it was passed. These are actual decisions our government made. Here's organized interest groups. Same dynamic. The more who support it, the more likely it is to have been passed. It's the way democracy is supposed to work. Here's the average citizen. That's a flat line, literally and figuratively. What this is saying is it doesn't matter the percentage of average citizens who support something. It doesn't change the probability of that thing having been enacted. As they put it in English, when the preferences of the economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. In a democracy, the average citizen's views do not matter to the actual decisions our government has taken. Right? This is the kind of naive image I think we all had about democracy in America. There we are, we the citizens, kind of middle of America, driving the bus. Here's the reality. The steering wheel has become removed because the system has been allowed to render us so radically unequal that a very few with power steer the bus, even if it promises that we are the ones steering. Here is the core idea. This promise of a representative democracy has been compromised by this inequality. And that compromise means that the system cannot function to produce a democracy that gives most citizens what most citizens believe their democracy should do. Okay, now, the great hope here is that we get it. It's not a surprise to anyone. Middle of the last presidential election in July of 2016, University of Maryland did this extraordinary study to measure attitudes about government, in particular extreme Trump supporters and extreme Clinton supporters. And they found the largest measured anger about government in the history of polling. Americans are more angry, more frustrated with their government than they'd ever been. But when they asked them why, the striking fact was there was no difference between Republicans and Democrats about why. So, corporations and their lobbyists have too much influence. 89% of all voters believe that, 89% of Republicans, 90% of Democrats. Elected officials think more about the interests of their donors than the common good, 89% of voters, 92% of Republicans, 88% of Democrats. Big campaign donors have too much influence. 91% of voters, 90% of Republicans, 91% of Democrats. This extraordinary fact that in this world where we think we are all so divided and America is teetering in this division, the fact is we are united about the fact that our government is not functioning and united about why. We all believe it is this corruption of the political system that is making it so our government cannot function. We believe something that is true. What is true is believed. It is believed by all. It is the greatest political resource for leveraging the opportunity to actually fix this problem that there is in our political system. So you would think then that everyone who is or had been thinking about running for president, and there's a large list of those people, would be talking about this. You'd think that this fact that we are all in agreement about this problem and the source of the problem and the solution for the problem would mean this would be the kumbaya we could finally find and sing together. But no, it's not working like that. There are, of course, many politicians who check the box of reform, tell us they believe in reform, and then practically every one of them speaks the language of fantasy politics. They talk about the beautiful things, as if we had a democracy already. They talk about single-payer health care or higher minimum wage, the Green New Deal, free college, as if winning is enough, as if getting more votes means getting what you want, as if the promise of this democracy had already been performed, as if the system were not rigged. But we should know better here. You can't promise these fantasies without fixing the system first. Or if you speak the language of fantasy without talking about fixing the system, then you are just not serious. You're playing a game of politics to get elected. You're not playing the game to govern America in a way that will solve the problems of America. You're just not serious unless you commit to fixing this first. I am so proud that my friend John Sarbanes, who's a congressman from Maryland, convinced the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, at the beginning of 2019, to introduce as H.R. 1 the most important and ambitious reform package that has been passed by the House of Representatives since the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This bill would address 85% of the problems that I've described in the inequality of our political system. It would radically change the way political campaigns for congresspeople were funded. No longer would they be dependent on raising money from the tiny, tiny few. They'd have an extraordinary opportunity to raise money in small contributions that would be matched, and it even had a pilot program to giving voters vouchers, which they could use to help fund political campaigns. Changing the business model of campaign fundraising, so the candidates are not focused on the tiny few, but they are focused on many. It had a provision to insist, because the Constitution gives Congress this power, that states do not gerrymander politically, at least when drawing congressional districts. It was a commitment to restoring the Voting Rights Act, an extraordinary mistake of the Supreme Court, withdrawing the incredible protections that guaranteed equal access to the ballot in the South. And it had an amazingly ambitious anti-revolving door provision that made it increasingly difficult for politicians and bureaucrats to do the business of Washington, which is to constantly spin between government and private business, always increasing their salary as they do so. This was an extraordinary bill, which of course, once it passed in the House, died on the floor of the Senate, as Mitch McConnell, the Dark Lord, declared that it was nothing more than a partisan game. It was a Democratic power grab. Now, I think this is a Democratic power grab, in the small d sense of democratic. It is a power grab to restore democracy. It's not a power grab for large D Democrats. It's a power grab to make sure that when we as citizens step up, we step up equally in this political system. So it was important not just because it was right, but the really incredibly important fact about H.R. 1 was that it was H.R. 1. What that said was, because it was first, it revealed that even Nancy Pelosi acknowledges the priority here, acknowledged the necessity of addressing this problem if anything else was possible. It was a way of them saying nothing else would be possible until we address this first. Nothing else was possible before this. Now, I think H.R. 1 should be an inspiration for us. I think we should take it and we should say, well, what about POTUS 1? If H.R. 1 was a commitment to fundamental reform and first, we should get every candidate to make an equivalent POTUS 1 commitment. We should get every candidate to answer, what is it that you promised to do on day one? How will you make that happen? And are you courageous enough to utter words which politicians somehow find it impossible to utter? Are you courageous enough to say we need public funding for public campaigns? Now, if they're not willing to say those things together, I will make a commitment of fundamental reform on day one that includes this critical element. If they don't do this, then I think we must say they are just not serious. We have to measure them against this standard set by the president. Who will best drain the swamp? And we need to do this work now. Because if it's not now, America will miss it. This is the one thing that unites us, but it seems increasingly to be an afterthought for them. An afterthought is not enough. It has to be the first thought. It has to be the first thing out of their mouth. Because nothing else is possible unless this is done, and they need to convince us that they get this, that nothing else is possible unless this thing is done. So will they? Well, there's good news here, and there's bad news here. Let's start with the good news. The fact is, over the last 6 months, many of them have. My organization, Equal Citizens, runs a POTUS 1 project where we're doing podcasts and town halls with as many candidates as we can. These 9 have so far made the POTUS 1 commitment. Their POTUS 1 commitment is fundamental reform on day one, and their fundamental reform is, from our measuring, substantial enough to have a substantial effect on the problem that I started with. Represent Us has a similar project, the Fix Democracy First project, where they have gotten these candidates to make a commitment that they will fix democracy first. So the point is, many different organizations have found this focus and are beginning to get the commitment from them that indeed their first move will be a move to address the democracy problem. But we've not yet seen this as first in what they present themselves as fighting for. So why is that? And this is where we get to the bad news. The bad news is, first, the media won't talk about this. What's striking is not a single question asked in any of the Democratic debates so far has been a question about democracy reform. Not a single media interrogator here has thought it important to address the one thing we have to do to make any of the other things even sensible. They don't think democracy reform is even an issue, so they don't ask the candidates about democracy reform. So at the end of a debate, you don't hear candidates talking about democracy reform because it's just not within the frame of what the media want to talk about. And it's not yet in the frame of what the candidates believe they have to talk about first. And the reason for this is that the experts in the political system, those people who said that, for example, Donald Trump could never be elected president, those people say that we don't care about this issue. Those people say it's too complicated. I had one of these consultants explain it to me in some impatience. He said, they're too stupid, talking about the people. They don't give about the process. So because they believe this fact of reform doesn't sell, what instead they do is sell snake oil to win an election. They go around and telling us all the pretty things they're going to give us, as if Santa Claus were on the stage. When they all know that none of it is possible until they address what they all know is this corrupted and broken political system. So to win a nation, to win a campaign, they're willing to lose a nation. So it's a question, a genuine question. Can we be convinced as a people to care about democracy first, to put aside differences that we might have as Republicans and Democrats and focused here first? It's a real question. There's reasons to be hopeful. In 2018, for example, we had the largest number of democracy reforms passed in the states in grassroots referenda ever in the history of the nation. Overwhelming frustration bubbling up in the states to attack the status quo because they have a mechanism through the referendum process to express themselves, and when they do it, it taps into an unseen energy in American citizens. In Michigan, a 20-something-year-old woman named Katie Fahey put a Facebook post up. It said, 2 days after the election, anybody want to work on gerrymandering? Within 2 months, there were 4,000 volunteers in Michigan who were going across the state to collect more than 400,000 signatures to get their petition on the ballot. And they raised, through tens of thousands of contributors, millions of dollars to fight this in television ads against an extraordinary amount of money against democracy reform. And the thing Katie Fahey told me about that fight is that there was a religion to that fight. And the first principle of that religion was, never could you talk about this as a Democratic issue or as a Republican issue. It was a citizen issue. It was not about how to make the Democrats more competitive or to make sure the Republicans had a shot. It was how to give people a sense that their political system was fair and honest in its promise to deliver democracy to the people. That energy produced unbelievable number of people willing to spend countless hours to do something no one thought was possible. And when they won with more than 61% of the vote in Michigan, they won because Democrats and Republicans and independents all believed a fair system was worth fighting for. That energy is out there. And the only question is, how do we tap it nationally? Is it possible to tap it in a presidential campaign? That's a yes or no question. And when I ask that question, and I see among the, quote, experts the resistance, I feel like I find myself in a place that has been the place I have always been throughout my career. So 20 years ago, this man, John Perry Barlow, who was an extraordinary poet, he used to write for the Grateful Dead, convinced me to write my first book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, which is about the nature of the internet. Barlow said, the internet guaranteed its freedom. It's a guaranteed space of free speech and privacy and innovation and opportunity. And what I said in this book is, John Perry, you're missing something important. The nature of the internet can be flipped. Because the internet is just an architecture, it's a technical architecture, and that architecture could change. And I said it would be changed. And in this book I said the governments and business would work together to change the very nature of the internet from a place that protected free speech and privacy and the opportunity to innovate to a space that would be much harder to speak freely, much less privacy, and much more control over the opportunity to innovate. New York Times didn't like this review, this book. David Pogue wrote, somewhat tepid review. He said, Lessig plays digital Cassandra. He predicts the internet will become a monster that tracks our every move, but that nobody will heed his warning. These discussions are thoughtful and measured, but the premise that frames them all is shaky. Lessig doesn't offer much proof that a Soviet-style loss of privacy and freedom is on its way. Unlike actual law, internet software has no capacity to punish. It doesn't affect people who aren't online. Only a tiny minority of the world's population is. And if you don't like the internet system, you can always flip off the modem. Now, I never knew exactly what he meant by maybe that's the flip off. But what I want to do is to embrace the Cassandra claim here. I'll take that Cassandra claim. Because I feel like I've played this Cassandra role repeatedly, a number of times. So 15 years ago, when Disney and others were so terrified about the internet and what it was doing with copyright, I wrote 2 books that said the thing we should fear is overreaction here. Because I thought that the fear was overblown and extreme, and if we reacted to it by building the technology to perfectly control what anybody can do on the internet, then we would radically suppress the opportunity of people to be creators and the opportunity of them to share their creativity. Now, We've built the system of tracking into the internet. If you upload something to YouTube, within 30 minutes, it has been scanned by a technology to determine whether there's any so-called copyrighted music in the video. And if there is, it will either take the video down, or it will turn off ads for the video, or it will tell you that you've committed copyright violations, and if you do it 3 times, you get kicked off of YouTube. So there are many creators out there who create and find themselves turned off because the system interprets their stuff as violating copyright. Here's one really compelling story by a guy who teaches people how to play guitar through his YouTube channel. So he does guitar lessons, and of course to teach people to play guitar, you got to play a couple riffs to show them what to do, and this is his experience.
This video, for example. In this video about licks, I'm playing a tiny lick of an Eagles song, just one lick. I'm not playing the last note. And now this video is completely blocked for viewers in the United States, where coincidentally my biggest public is. And all the advertising money videos making from the rest of the world goes to them. Everything, not 1 cent from me. So for a 2-second lick, 8 little notes, in a freaking 15-minute long video, doesn't matter. The rest of the video doesn't matter.
Or even my friend Aaron Swartz. So Aaron Swartz is an extraordinary genius who inspired many people in the context of the internet and in civil liberties. Aaron Swartz was the inventor of the protocol of RSS, or he worked with others to develop that. He was the architect behind Creative Commons. He was one of the founders of Reddit, designed the technical architecture for Reddit, all of this before he was 20. Aaron Swartz, 12 years ago, came to me and he said, "Why are you wasting your time on these issues of copyright and internet policy, so long as we have this corrupted government? What do you think you're ever going to get?" And I said, "Aaron, it's not my field." And he said, "What do you mean? It's not your field as an academic?" I said, "Yeah, it's not my field as an academic. I do internet policy and copyright." And he said, "Is it your field as a citizen?" And that conversation on December 29th, 2006 in Berlin with Aaron Swartz led me to give up the work I was doing on copyright and the internet. And I announced from that moment I was devoting my life to this fight. Actually, I said I would devote 10 years. It turned out to take longer than 10 years, but 10 years at least, but now it's my life to this fight to restore this democracy from this system of corruption. And I've written now 4 books. Again, the 4th is out next month. You should pre-order right now. But 4 books to try to help people see and to rally people to this fundamental reform first. But in 2008, even Aaron Swartz came to me and he said, "Why? Why do we need to do this? Because we're going to elect Barack Obama, and he's going to get us everything we need, and we won't have to fight for fundamental reform because he will make it happen." So I stand before you as Cassandra, who I think I've got some useful examples of my warnings actually being Cassandra-like, because remember, her warnings were true. She just couldn't get people to believe them. And here's the Cassandra warning: we must make them reformers, our politicians, our leaders, or we will lose the capacity to govern. Not just on the issues we all talk about like climate change or healthcare or infrastructure or economic growth, but also on the issues we should be talking about: AI's increasing prevalence in our society, surveillance in everything that we do, the future of work, robot overlords that will be taking over every corner of our economy. These too we need a capacity to talk about, but to talk about them in a meaningful way, we need a sensible government. Sensible government is not optional in the 21st century. But let me make a little kind of Hollywood Cassandra mix here. Because I do think, in the end, this is an optimistic story. I do think we can do this. This election is the first time in 12 years I think there's a real shot to making fundamental reform happen. We can push candidates who will unify America around this issue rather than divide us on this issue. We need to get them to reform, and if we do that, and I agree it's a big if, but it's an important if we can get them to commit to a POTUS 1 platform, then I think it is possible. For the first time, I think it is possible. It is possible we will win, which means democracy wins, which means sensible governance would be possible again. It's not easy, it's not even clear. But just recognize it is 10 times more likely today than it was 4 years ago. And if we can win in this one fight, it is possible. It is possible, and it's just necessary if we're to have what we promised our children we would give them. Okay, one more thought here. So on April 2nd, 2008, which my computer tells me is 4,202 days ago, Barack Obama gave a speech in Philadelphia before the AFL-CIO, telling us we had to take up that fight. Here's what he said. If we're not willing to take up that fight, the fight to change the way Washington works, then real change that will make a lasting difference in the lives of ordinary Americans, will keep getting blocked by the defenders of the status quo. Take up that fight. Barack Obama was a friend of mine when we taught at Chicago. I think he was a great president, but he never took up that fight. Never after he beat Clinton in the primary did he even mention the fight, and never in 8 years in office did he even propose the changes that would begin to address this fundamental corruption of our democracy. He did not take up the fight. But what he said then was right then and is right now. If we don't take up that fight, then real change that will make a lasting difference in the lives of ordinary Americans, will keep getting blocked by the defenders of the status quo. Now, when we think about taking up that fight, we should ask, for whom are we taking up that fight? You know, I'm a big brain sort of guy, so I would say, of course, it's for reason. It's logic that tells us we must take up this fight. But I'm also a weepy and sappy romantic. So I would say it's for love that we must take up this fight. It's for love of country. It's for love of our kids. Because who loses because we can't govern? We are obviously and persistently wrecking our climate, and that won't change until we fix our democracy. But who pays for this destruction? It's not us. We will be long gone. It is them who pay. It has been literally 20 years since Columbine. 20 years. And massacre after massacre. And we still can't muster the political courage to pass legislation to protect our kids. They pay the price directly. As we watch our debt balloon, our literally borrowing money from our kids, money we will never pay back before they have to pay it back, the burden of that debt is felt by them, not us. As a healthcare system spirals out of control with costs unbelievable in the comparable world markets because of policy gifts that our government gives to pharmaceutical companies and insurance costs that are much too high and deliver much too little for us. It is not just us, it is especially them who will pay that price. Every single problem that we talk about is a problem that is a problem for them. We can't govern, and they pay the price. We've put this on them. Tom Brokaw wrote about my grandfather's generation, the greatest generation. Are we the worst generation? They sacrificed for us. What have we sacrificed for them? Now, there's no reason we must be that generation. We can inspire the politicians then. We can inspire them. Politics is about inspiring, and usually it's about them inspiring us. The John Kennedys, with their magic words, inspiring us to stand up for the nation. Now it's our turn. This time, it's us who must inspire them. This time, it's us who must say to them, you have to take up this fight. Because if you don't take up this fight, then real change that will make a lasting difference in the lives of our children, will keep getting blocked by the defenders of the status quo. Thank you very much. Yeah, sure.
We wanted to open the forum here for Q&A. If you had some questions for Professor Westlake, I could walk around with the microphone. I just ask that you stand up and state your name and then clearly present the question. Would anyone like to?
So when this happened today, the students, everybody's hand went up. It was like really hard work. I had to take a nap this afternoon because...
What does an individual do to join in the fight?
Yeah. I think what we all have to do first is just begin this demand. Like, I imagine you meet politicians too. Imagine you're in public, if you're here, you probably go to town halls. And if you go to town halls, you see politicians. And though New Jersey isn't a swing state, so you're not going to see a lot of presidential candidates here, they'll raise money in New York. Maybe you can go to New York. But the point is, when you see them, this is what you have to say. What are you going to do to fix democracy first? And when they start telling you about their amazing healthcare plan, or how they're going to give free college to kids, or climate change, they're going to guarantee $10 trillion, and you need to say to them, I don't believe that until you tell me how you're going to fix democracy first. And if we all take up this challenge of changing the conversation for them, they will respond. They're built to respond. That's what their business is about, responding to what people demand. But somehow we have to force them to take this up. And I thought the media would get it. They would do it for us in part. Turns out they're no better than the politicians. So I think that's like one simple thing that we can each commit to doing. And whether that's writing letters to the editor, or writing the campaigns, or speaking to the campaigns, or going to candidates, or like starting your own organization. I've started 5 so far. That's the challenge, to get them to frame the problem in a way that we know what the solution would be.
We have someone back here,
Yep.
a student that was at the afternoon session.
Oh, great.
Had a question, she came back.
Wonderful.
So I completely agree with you on the grounds that our democracy is compromised. But we watched a TED Talk in recent class where you talked about lessers and how a lot of our government is being managed and essentially elected by a small group of organizations that you refer to as the lessers. So while I agree this is a problem, and I'm gonna, I see that, you did say in this presentation that more than ever you see our country coming together in this period of time more than any other. I see it the other way, that, political topics that we fight over, we're more divisive than ever. America is more split. Our political climate is incredibly intense, and we are polarized to 2 different political sides. So I want to know what I can do, and what other Americans can do, and what our politicians can do is to take that first step to bring the government really in the management of it back to the people. So I do agree with you, but I'd like to know, I guess, what your take is.
Right, so let me start by just making sure we're on the same page about this obscure Lester reference. So when I was doing the numbers of calculating how many people are the relevant funders of campaigns, the people who actually matter, the people who are actually called, it turns out that number is about the same number as the number of people named Lester in the United States. Okay. I'm one of those Lesters, so like I could make fun of Lesters. But the point was, it was to get people to see that we have a system where it's the funders, think of it as the Lesters, who you have to make happy before you have a chance to run for office. If you can't convince the Lesters, you can't run for office. So just like, in Texas, used to have a white primary in the Democratic Party. The only way to run in the Democratic Party was to go through the primary. The only people who could vote were white people. Obviously, that was a system that made it so white people controlled the agenda of the Democratic Party and politics in Texas. The Lesterland system, the system where it's these funders who you have to please to get elected, is a system where guarantees the funders have this power inside. So thank you for bringing that reference here. So then the question is, what do you do about it? Here's the really deep reason why this is a problem, why this problem is so difficult. So let's say you want to run for president, which you can't right now, you're a little young for that, but soon enough. And you sit down with your advisors and you say, I need to run for president. And they say, okay, you got to go through the primaries. And to succeed in the primaries, you got to rally a base. And to rally a base, you need to talk to the most engaged people in your party. So if you're a Democrat, what that means is you got to go out and you got to really excite the progressive base. And how do you excite the progressive base? Well, right now you excite the progressive base by saying things like single-payer healthcare, or free college for all, or Green New Deal. Now, I personally think all of those ideas are great ideas. I love them. But what I know is if you talk that way in order to become the nominee, when you become the nominee, it's going to be really hard to turn around to the rest of America and say, oh, here are the things we all agree about. Like, we have a corrupted political system, we have to address that corrupted political system. So I think that even though, and I know at least two of them I've had this conversation with, they totally agree. This is the thing that has to be fixed first, but it is incredibly difficult to become a nominee talking about this issue first. That reality makes it hard to get the candidate who is able to do what you feel like is so difficult to do, which is to rise above the partisan division. The point is, it pays to play the politics of hate. It pays the media, it pays the politicians. I showed a graph today to them. I just wanted to make sure I had it, just in case this kind of question came up. This is the scariest graph in America. Okay, now you could have said the flatline graph was pretty scary, and that is, but this is even more scary. So this is a graph that begins in a harmless way. So these are the three major cable networks, MSNBC, Fox News, and CNN. This is analysis of the political content of those networks. And what this is saying is the ideology circa 2001 was indistinguishable. They were the same network. You couldn't say one was conservative, you couldn't say one was liberal. They were basically the same. Here's the time since 2001. So we have a world where people are put into their buckets. As Barack Obama said, if you watch Fox News, you are in one reality. If you read the New York Times, you're in a different reality. So we live in different realities. And the business model of connecting to people in those different realities is the business model of hate. That's how you win. And the challenge is, how do we rise above that? And what I'm saying, I think this question here, and I would say the same thing to you, it only is going to happen if we begin to push back against that and demonstrate something that pushes back against that. So the hardest thing for us on the left, progressives especially, is to do anything that seems like it's being nice to somebody on the right. Oh my God, you can't believe the kind of abuse that you get if you're ambiguous about your ideology. You're allowed to be ambiguous about your gender, that's fine, but your ideology, you're thrown out of the room. And so it's hard for us, but we need that courage to do it. We need to begin to find contexts where people on the left and people on the right can stand together and say, you're an idiot on 75 issues. You're just completely wrong. I think you're wrong about the wars. I think you're wrong about healthcare. I think you're wrong about the economy. You're wrong, wrong, wrong. But we both agree this is a deeply corrupted political system that has to change. There's a great organization called Take Back Our Republic, which is led by, there's a character from Central Casting, this kind of right-wing, white, Alabama conservative Republican, John Putner. I love John Putner. I disagree with everything John Putner believes, except on the issues of reform. And Putner and his group of conservatives is fighting for reform. But what he knows too is that he can't be seen to being nice to liberals. If he's too close to liberals, his conservative base will say, oh, no, you're a turncoat. We can't have anything to do with you. We have to kick you out. This is the pathology of our politics, and it's just going to take some, pain to get above it. It's going to take courage to rise above it. It needs the ability to just turn down the self-righteousness that we all feel in our political camps, in our tribes. Turn down the self-righteousness, recognize the humility of our errors, and stand together on at least those things we can stand together on. Now, I dreamed that there would be a candidate running for president who would have done this. There isn't. I think some are close. I think Elizabeth Warren thinks that she's going to become the corruption candidate. She talks that way increasingly. She hasn't yet given us a real public campaign finance solution, so I don't think she's there yet, but she's saying, we don't fix the corruption, nothing else will happen. And others are talking about it too, so it's better than it otherwise would have been, but I really would have loved to see a candidate who would have started from the beginning and said, look, bracket everything else. Nothing is going to happen until we fix this. You might be a right-winger, you might want these things, you might be a left-winger, you want those things, but nothing until we fix this. Thanks for coming back.
You said before that in the primary, the extremes on both sides of the bill. The president, even if you can get a presidential candidate or a candidate to embrace what you're talking about, really can't do much without the Senate and the Congress.
Absolutely.
And we saw it with Obama. Unfortunately, it took him 7 years to figure out he had to do executive actions, but and Trump's figured it out right away, unfortunately. But so how do we address that? I mean, even if we can get a presidential candidate to embrace what we're talking about, we still have to deal with the Senate and Congress that are elected by or put in place by the extremists.
Yeah, I don't want to sound too Warren-esque, but I got a plan for that. So you're exactly right. I think one of the biggest problems is that we have this Superman fantasy, Superwoman fantasy, super person fantasy. But the point is we have this fantasy that a president can solve the problems. But the problem, the core problem is Congress. Congress is the corrupted institution. We can elect presidents who are not corrupted. We haven't done a great job, often, but it's possible. Barack Obama was not a corrupt president. He was incredibly decent, had exactly the right values, and really wanted to push hard to do it. We can do that. We can't elect a non-corrupted Congress. We can't do that right now. And we can't do that because they are corrupted by the way they raise money. They're not criminals. I don't think they accept bribes. I think it's the cleanest Congress in the history of Congress from that standpoint. I mean, a couple have been gone down because of their criminal behavior, but on the whole, these are decent people on the right and the left who go to Washington for the right reasons and then find themselves in the system that most of them can't believe. Most of them go there naively believing they're going to be legislating. And then they're told by their leadership, you got to spend half your time at least on the telephone begging people for money. They are corrupted. That is the problem that has to be solved. So here's a strategy. So it turns out, I'll just give you a fantasy. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but here's the fantasy. So it turns out that the Speaker of the House can be anybody. It could be the Queen of England. The Constitution doesn't say anything about the qualifications of the Speaker of the House. It just says It's the person who the House votes to elect. So imagine somebody, let's kind of, I'm kind of looking for the billionaire version of Tom Hanks who's a woman. That's what I'm looking for. But, that person who leads a movement like this and says, what we're going to do is we're going to elect 25 members of Congress, or whatever it takes to control Congress, like whatever the number is, so that you would have the balance of control. We're going to elect that number. Half of them will be Republicans, half of them will be Democrats. And we'll elect them as Republicans by going to safe seat Republican districts and running reformer candidates against the incumbent. Because what we know from our data is if you're in a safe seat Republican district and a Republican, especially a conservative Republican, is a reformer, he kills, not literally, but kills the other candidate. Republicans love safe Republican reformers. If it's a contested district, it's a different story, because they're really keen to make sure they get their Republican and they'll vote for any Republican, doesn't matter. But if it's a choice between two Republicans, one of whom they know is going to go to Washington, they'll pick the reformer over the non-reformer. So go into those districts in primaries and win enough primary victories in safe seat Republican seats to guarantee you're going to have at least half of this number Republican, half of this number Democrat. Then they go to Washington and they tell both parties, we're going to vote with whatever caucus agrees to this plan. We'll pass fundamental reform. First, we will elect this female billionaire version of Tom Hanks as our speaker. We will pass fundamental reform. And once fundamental reform has been signed by Congress, we will dissolve as a caucus. The speaker will go home, and we'll go back to business as usual. So the thing about that plan is that you can see that it doesn't require taking over a party, doesn't require taking over all of Congress. It's a relatively small number of people you would have to elect to get control enough so that you could leverage into the system the opportunity for change. Now, this depends on Mitch McConnell not being in the Senate. He really is the Dark Lord. I mean, he is, of all the people, the worst. I don't say that because he's a conservative. I have many very good friends who are conservatives in Congress, and I have enormous respect for them. I say that because he doesn't care about the job he is supposed to do, which is to make Congress work. He thinks the job is to nominate judges, to appoint judges to the courts and to the Supreme Court. That's all he wants to do, and to stop everything else. And that's what he's done. He's stopped everything else. You can see the well in the Senate is just filled with brilliant ideas that have been sent over and die in his legislative graveyard. And the only thing they do is they pass amendments to the rules for putting judges on, and they just nominate judge after judge after judge. 3 times the number of judges have been sent through under Trump in the same time as Obama. And Obama had an extremely suppressed number of judges because the Senate would never agree to nominate his judges. So that's an essential part of the story. You've got to get rid of McConnell. It's possible. Moscow Mitch is not very popular in Kentucky today. But if you do that, then I think that this kind of, and I can tell you there are groups that are working on figuring out how to pull together the resource to make a plan like this work. But it depends on there being a reason to fight for it. That's why it depends on a president. So these things go together. You have a president who says she's going to fight for this, then you have a reason to rally to build this control or this reform caucus inside of Congress. Somebody has a mic.
How do you reform Congress? We're in a state where we don't have the ability to have citizen-led petitions on the ballot. You're in a district that's one of those funky gerrymandered ones. 95% of our representatives support each kind of district. And any comments made locally are said to be from outside agitators. How do you work in that kind of situation when they've got tons of money? How do you address that? It's a split district, it's R+1, maybe legal D at the moment. How do you fix things when you're in a stacked deck, when you're not in a safe Republican or a safe Democratic seat to make change?
So I don't think we fix it until we change the way we fund elections. So I think you fight for people who are going to change the way you fund elections. If you were in a state with referenda, you can use state referenda to change gerrymandering. You know, you did something interesting with gerrymandering here 2 years ago. So it's not the thing to do here, but the thing to do here is to just join the fight to reform the funding, because reform the funding and you change that dynamic. And if you don't reform the funding, just give up on that, fixing that dynamic. It doesn't matter which side you're on. They all raise money from the same people. You know, and so people say, what about a third party? Wouldn't a third party do something? A third party would raise money from the same people too. It's just, you know, it's a small list of people that would be giving money to politicians. And so the point is, this is the change. And we need people to talk about it. So, you know, I mean, Andrew Yang has done an extraordinary job in this presidential cycle of introducing really important ideas. He's, you know, one generation ahead of the politicians. They don't quite get it. I was really astonished when he talked about universal basic income, and Bernie Sanders said, no, he didn't support that. You know, he had this idea of like going back to the 1950s and people working 40 hours a week in factories. And, you know, Andrew Yang is like, that's just not our future. You know, robots will mean that's not our future. We have to think about that. So he's done that really well. He did a really important thing in taking up this charge of how to change campaign finance. He wants democracy dollars. Everybody gets $100 of democracy dollars. And you can only use that, it's like food stamps but for politics, you can only use that to help fund campaigns. And that would radically change how politicians raise money. They would be interested in you, a citizen in the district, because you have money for them. And that would be an important fix. Now, when he raised that idea, most of the media didn't even know what he was talking about. Most of them kind of laughed at the idea. It was like such a silly idea. But that's a measure of their ignorance, not the importance of his idea. And so getting people to talk and push that, I think, is what we have to do.
What do you think about Obama's efforts against gerrymandering that he's taken up since he left office? Do you think he's being effective? Should we all be joining in with him?
Well, you know, I think that gerrymandering has been fought in the wrong way for many, many years. So one way that people have fought gerrymandering is through the courts. There's a kind of romantic Thurgood Marshall image of like a lawyer racing to the Supreme Court and getting the Supreme Court to spread justice everywhere. That's not going to happen. And the recent Supreme Court decisions made it clear that court's not going to fix partisan gerrymandering. So the court system is a bust. And I also think that going state by state is not the most efficient strategy here, because going state by state is extremely expensive and slow. Now, the benefit is that if you fix gerrymandering state by state, you're fixing it for every office from federal all the way down. But the simpler way to get federal gerrymandering fixed is what H.R. 1 did. H.R. 1 leveraged the Constitution's authority, Article 1, Section 4, which expressly gives Congress the power to step in and adjust the rules that exist in the state for electing members of Congress. And leveraging that power, Congress coder say there will not be partisan gerrymandering in a state, or set up a process to make sure there's not partisan gerrymandering in the lines drawn for Congress. And that means in a single statute, in a single year, 2021, you could have that law, and by 2024, it would have changed the lines in a pretty profound way. So I think that's the right thing to do. Now, the president is not pushing that. He's pushing the state-by-state system. So, you know, he's pushing in the right direction, but I don't think it's the most effective way to take up that fight.
No one has so far.
The students all stood up. They were much more respectful, yeah.
And I've been enjoying what you say, but also see a bigger challenge. Our Constitution is an 18th century product. We're a world that was quite a bit different than our world is now. And is democracy the golden ticket? We had the Weimar Republic elected Hitler in some sort of way. And we faced the three big challenges that I think part of which you mentioned. the environmental challenge. We're about to go to war with Mother Nature. And I hope we win. We have the internet that you're so familiar with. And we still have, remember, nuclear weapons? Proliferation of nuclear weapons. They weren't around in the 18th century. So how do we, is it time to, democracy 2? Or something like that? Is it time to think about that?
I certainly think that our Constitution is deeply flawed in its amendment procedure. It's essentially an unamendable Constitution right now. The way an amendment gets ratified is 2/3 of Congress proposes an amendment, and 3/4 of the states, either state legislatures or state conventions, ratify it, which means 38 states have to ratify it, which means 13 states can block any amendment, which means it's extremely hard to imagine addressing some of the most important problems through the amendment process. Now, it's incredibly hard, but the most likely amendment process is something called the Article 5 Convention. Article 5 is the part of the Constitution that governs amendment. And in Article 5, there's a procedure that says you can propose amendments through Congress, or the states can call on Congress to convene a convention that has the power to propose amendments. It's never been done, although we've come close twice. The most important time was when the Senate was still appointed by state legislatures. They came within 1 or 2 states of a convention for the purpose of changing that, and it scared the hell out of Washington, so they quickly sent out an amendment to change the way senators were elected or selected. We have never had one of these, and that terrifies people. People are like, well, what could a convention do? Like, maybe they'll destroy the Constitution. And indeed, at first it was Phyllis Schlafly and the John Birchers who were most energized against the convention. John Birch Society said that a convention would destroy the Bill of Rights, and it would also make fluoride in our water across the country. So, that's why it had to be fought. But now it's actually liberals who are most vigorously opposing a convention. My friend Robert Reich, who was head of Common Cause, has been on the warpath against the idea of a convention because he thinks it's too dangerous to allow a process for proposing amendments that's not within the control of Congress. Now, when I talked to him about this, I was trying to get him to at least tone down some of the mistakes in rhetoric in what he was saying. I talked to him about this before the election. He said, why? I said, I understand your argument. I understand we need constitutional change. But why risk it? He said, we're going to have a president who's going to appoint 3 justices in the Supreme Court, and they'll get us the change we want through the Supreme Court. I haven't had a chance to ask him what Plan B is. Because it's clear the changes about democracy that we want, the Supreme Court's not going to make. But I think it's more fundamental than that. I just am so frustrated by this elite constitutionalism, this belief that our Constitution has to be kept far from the people, that we shouldn't ever have any process for touching it that isn't just lawyers arguing to judges. If that's all we are capable of, we don't deserve to be a constitutional republic. We need to bring the Constitution back down to ordinary people so it becomes part of our life again. And so I think we need a process for amending the Constitution that does not depend on lawyers and judges, that increasingly involves us as citizens in that process. Now, it's another hour-long talk to sort of describe how that could work, and I don't want to spend too much time in trying to address it, but I agree with you, this is a problem that has to be fixed, and this is one way I think we could fix it.
Okay, my question is about media and the extreme concentration of our media in social ends and essentially such wealthy ends. How do we fight that? Because they choose what gets covered. I mean, part of the free coverage Trump got was because he was a novelty and everybody thought he couldn't win. He still controls so much of that. How do we as people wrest that most important section of the money-raising group out of their hands and the news out of their hands?
See, so I spent many years believing exactly as you just said, that the problem here was the concentration in the media. And now I think that's not the problem at all. Because even though you're right, media is incredibly concentrated in ownership, it's incredibly competitive in content. And that's part of the problem. Because the business model of cable television, for example, in a world of fragmented markets, is to polarize. It's to play the politics of hate. It's to build a loyal base. It's that graph I showed you, right? This is the business model. And that's because that's the only way to build ad revenue for that network. And so the problem that these people face is they're doing the rational strategy in a highly competitive media environment to win the money that they need. You know, in 2015, for reasons we can leave off the table, in August, I spent a lot of time in cable news network stations. And this was when Donald Trump was on 24/7. And I would have this conversation with producers all the time. Why is this guy on your network? And all the time they would say, we hate it, we hate it. And I said, well then, why don't you not have him on your network? Why do you do this? And they said, oh, we have no choice. If we don't cover him, people will just turn the channel and go to a place that is covering him, because he is exactly as you described, this kind of freak. People just wanted to see him like do his freaky stuff. So the competitive pressure that they faced is what drove them to cover in that way. And so, you know, the old days, broadcast democracy, when there were 3 networks that basically covered at same news time at the same time every day, and basically covered the news in a pretty central way. I'm not saying they were unbiased or they covered everything in the right way, but I'm saying that everybody saw it. That was much more concentrated, and it produced a media environment where it was harder to be Donald Trump. Like Donald Trump in 1974 was not imaginable. Right? And he imagined himself as president in 1974, but it was unimaginable he could run for president because that environment, more concentrated in content, would have filtered it out. Now that again is another hour-long talk that I kind of gave today, but how to solve that. But sorry, you want to?
Like our local paper here, The Record, which was with, I think, the Wall Street Journal, one of the 2 papers that really fought Christie on Bridgegate and brought out so many things that Christie was doing. Well, about 2 years ago, they were acquired by USA Today.
Yeah.
And
okay, so now I'm going to agree with you. Now I'm going to agree with you. The part that you're absolutely right about is local journalism and local television. Because what this media structure has done is to completely denude local journalism and local television from their critical constitutional role, which is to be critical investigative journalists on local government. That's their job. But they can't do that anymore because they don't have the resources to do that anymore. They've been told not to do it anymore. Sinclair Network is like an astonishing propaganda network, right? Because they have, you know, talking points that every one of their outlets repeats, literally word for word, these talking, but they all come from top down. They're not what traditional journalism has been about, which is bottom-up investigative reporting. So that part, I agree with you, and that's a really hard part to solve. But it just happens to be the second part of the book, They Don't Represent Us, which you can order today on Amazon if you'd like. I'm so grateful that you would come out on a night like this and give me some time to talk. Thank you so much.
Okay, so following on this topic is the perfect program on October 17th, which is called the Self-Righteous Society. So come to that program on the 17th of October. Look forward to seeing you all there.